Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome back to another MTG Arena deck here on my channel. Lately I have been grinding pretty hard. You might have caught that on my stream, and I went all the way from I think 94-95% up to rank 19 with Izzet Drakes. The deck seems to be really well positioned on Arena with the meta game right now. There's very few Nexus combo or Esper control, which are the two worst matchups, making the deck seemingly really well positioned. I'm currently sitting at a record of 46-24 over 70 matches in best of 3, putting me close to a win rate of 67%, almost. It's like 65 or 66, I think 66 right now. I was until my last stream with it, where I went 4 and 6, having a really rough run. I was at around 69%, so I had a bit of a downswing there at the end. But yeah, all in all, the deck has been crushing and carried me all the way to rank 19, which is amazing. So I wanted to finally make a deck tag for it, share it with you guys. So yeah, you might have seen my post already, but this time I'm getting you the full scoop and ins and outs, what I learned about the deck and what I like and dislike, and so on. But yeah, before we get started, make sure to hit the subscribe button if you're new to the channel and turn on notification icon to not miss out on future content. But now onto the deck list. Okay, so most people know the deck already. The core plan of the deck is sort of tempo-y. You have your 4 Pteramanders, 4 Enigma Drakes, and 4 Crackling Drake that you kind of try to get out there and race people with. You get into a lot of races. The deck can go a little longer, but it doesn't grind that well, so you mostly depend on some form of tempo, even though it's a bit different and the games are longer than with Mono Blue, for example. But it's still a race deck in a way. Okay, so first of all, we have the cantrips, 4 Opt, 4 Charter Course, 4 Discovery. Not much to say about those. They're your bread and butter. They fuel your Pteramander and your Drake, smooth out your draws, give you card selection, and so on and so forth, to just do a lot for the deck. One thing to note about Discovery Dispersal is people lately have been running 1 Black Source for Dispersal. I have not cast Dispersal in 70 matches, so I eventually just cut the Blood Crypt, since having to shock myself came up a bunch in 70 matches and it mattered here and there, while Dispersal just never mattered. And being able to not take damage against Mono Red or White Winnie or even Mono Blue can be very important. And being able to just play a mountain turn 1 with a shock, to have the option to shock, is pretty good, but having to deal 2 damage to yourself with a Blood Crypt to do that is really bad, and also telegraphs your shock. So there are a bunch of downsides to the Blood Crypt, and I have not really found an upside, other than sometimes, I guess, being a mana source for Discovery. That came up once or twice, I think, that I was screwed on blue and could play Discovery with the Blood Crypt, but yeah, I don't think it's worth it by now. Then we have the removal suit for shock, for Lava Coil, also very standard. This is cheap and efficient. This is not as cheap and not as flexible, but very efficient and deals with a lot of annoying things, including some of the recurring threats like Rekindling Phoenix and so on. I currently don't have a Beacon Bolt in the main. I have cut that lately. I had a Beacon Bolt for a while and I kinda like it, but it is a bit clunky, and sometimes you can't even deal a lot of damage on turn 3 with some draws, so it can be awkward. I at some point had 3 Lava Coil, 1 Melody and 1 Bolt, but ultimately went back to 4 Coil, 1 Melody, because Coil kills most of the things that Bolt does and is much more efficient and cheaper, and the deck really cares about mana efficiency and doing as many things in 1 turn as possible to catch up or get ahead. 1 Melody, I could see 2, I just don't like to cut anything for the second, but Melody is really good, and 1 to 2 is a fine number. BBD, for example, in the Pro Tour right now is running 2. Although 2 can be a bit clunky, because when they're bad, they're pretty bad, because they are expensive and clunky, and also having too much removal in your deck hurts you in your bad matchups. And I didn't feel like I need another one, so it's fine. But yeah, I could see maybe trying to go down to 3 Lava Coil and add a second Melody to the main and put the Lava Coil, basically swapping a Lava Coil and a Melody between main deck and sideboard. And then the last slot is kind of the interaction protection suit. 2 dive down, 3 spell pierce. Minguchi has been running 3 and 3. BBD at the PT has been running the opposite split, like 3 dive down and 2 spell pierce. I think it's close between 2-3 and 3-2, but I felt like dive down isn't that necessary. The deck sees a lot of cards, so unless it's like a very devastating tempo swing type of situation, your creature dying is often not that bad. But spell pierce is really good against your bad matchups, especially Nexus, but also control decks in general. It also is much better against planeswalkers, like spell piercing a Teferi or a Vivian is much better than dive downing their minus abilities. Even if only because you have to attack the planeswalker afterwards the next turn, wasting a lot of damage. And also spell pierce is a much better at trading with cards from your opponent at your will. Also surprisingly good against White Weenie, countering History of Venalia, and sometimes even a Legion's Landing, just trading 1 for 1, basically turning it into a better shock in that situation is totally fine. Something that dive down also can't do. And yeah, it's just a bit more proactive. This is super reactive and just relevant. If you have a creature out and they target your creature, all this does a lot more. I can see the issue of people playing around it and knowing you have it, but with 4 Charter Cores you can also just discard it a fair share of the time. So for now I'm gonna stick to 3 Pierce, 2 Dive Down, although there are some arguments for the 3rd Dive Down, like Niv-Mizzet and Warboss out of the sideboard, for example, and people playing around Spell Pierce. But I felt like when Spell Pierce is good, it's much better than Dive Down when Dive Down is good, and it's also relevant more often. And I just felt it's pretty important to be able to interact with your opponent in the early turns where Dive Down does nothing. I had it sit in my hand a bit too often, which is why I chose that number. And one of the biggest differences of my list over all the other ones that I've seen is I run 22 lands. This deck, like I said, is a tempo deck, even though more of a mid-rangey tempo deck than Mono Blue. So most games that I lost with the deck were basically because I was stuck on mana. Either because I mulliganed to death because I didn't get a functional opening hand with enough mana, or because I stuck on like 2 or 3 mana, or even like having to keep a good 1 land opt hand and then not finding enough land to get into the game and stuff. So I feel like the worst thing you can do to this deck is just run a greedy amount of lands, because the deck is pretty good at mitigating that. You have Charter Cores, you have Discovery, you have Opt, you have a lot of like you have Crackling Drake that is a 2 for 1, you have the Melody and so on. Your sideboard is also very good at mitigating that. Also your sideboard raises the curve. So yeah, the deck feels much better with 22 lands now. 21 just felt miserable. I understand the 21 in older versions that had 4 additional 2-cost cantrips, like Tormenting Voice or Radical Idea, because they have a critical mass where at least if you have 2 lands, you're always gonna get there, while this list just doesn't. I just lost too much because of it all the time, and if you don't like hit your first 4 land drops with this deck and fall behind, you just have a really hard time catching up and just lose the game. And there's no need for that. The deck takes that extra land that you might draw pretty well, but takes the like land drop that you miss really poorly. So yeah, I would definitely recommend the 22 lands in this version of the deck. The Phoenix list that LSV is running right now is a different story, and the 21 totally fine in that, because you have more cantrips and Electromancer and you're grindy than this deck is. You're more of a control deck. yeah, so distribution is 8 and 6. If you would run 21, I would also definitely recommend the 7-6 Mountain Island split, not the 8-5 that a lot of people have been running lately. I don't get it. Like, you have 4 Crackling Drake, and this, like I said, this deck is a kind of curve tempo type deck, so not having the second red on turn 4 with a Crackling Drake in hand is devastating. It's super important most of the time to just slam it on curve, and that's why you want a reasonably even distribution. I wouldn't go for 7-7 in the 22, but I would definitely go for 7-6 in 21, not 8-5. I don't get it. Like, people have been running 6-6 and a Guild Gate on the Pro Tour before, like Guild of Ravnica, like Watanabe, for example, and suddenly people decided for no apparent reason and no real change that they somehow want to gimp their red access significantly, which I don't understand. Sure, you get Pteramander, which is like a late game double blue card, but it's not a card that you need to play turn 1 a lot, so it really doesn't matter that much to have that extra turn 1 blue. It only matters basically when you know what you're up against and they don't play like red burn spells, and or if you have like a Charter Course for turn 2. And even then, like in the 22 you have 12, and even with 11 it's totally fine. So yeah, I just don't think Pteramander is enough of a reason to cripple your Crackling Drake. Crackling Drake on curve's much more important than Pteramander turn 1. Okay, so yeah, that's the main deck. Pretty standard, just a couple of subtle differences. The 20-second land being the most important one, and it's kind of close between the swap here, like I mentioned, and the Lava Coil Melody distribution. I don't think I want a 10s removal in the deck. I think I only want like 9, because drawing too many removal makes it even harder to beat Esper and Nexus. And I also didn't feel like I necessarily need additional removal in the main against creature matchups either. Okay, on to the sideboard. We have 2 Shivan Fire. They come in against mono blue, mono red, mono white basically. That's about it. But they're really good there. Just having a bit more cheap, efficient 1-mana answers early on to not fall behind is great. I've liked this a lot better than Cannonade. Also because Cannonade is basically only good against White Weenie and still pretty situational against White Weenie. And pretty bad against mono blue and mono red. Not to say basically unplayable. And Shivan Fire is good against all 3 of them. And I didn't feel like I need Cannonade most of the time if I have enough cheap early interaction to not fall behind. And like having a ton of melodies manages the History of Benalias pretty well, plus leaving in a couple of spell pierce. Then I have 1 Disdainful Stroke and 3 Negate. I have been going back and forth between like 4 to 5 counters. And started with 2 Stroke and 2 Negate, like Minguchi. I basically started from Minguchi's list with like very subtle differences. And yeah, right now like Negate just counters more things against the matchups where you want the counters, and Stroke is kind of just mostly nice to sometimes get the odd ooze or Crisis out of the Nexus deck if they decide to bring it in, or like Lyra out of a control deck or something. But most of the time it's just doing the same thing as Negate does. Sometimes, and sometimes less. But it can hit a couple things that Negate can't, so it's nice to have this 3-1 split, I think. If I would run a 5th, for a while I had 2 Stroke, 3 Negate, but at this point I would probably run 4 Negate, 1 Stroke, if I would run a 5th. Then we have 1 Sorcerer's Spyclass. I haven't played that for most of the time, I just added it recently, because it's actually pretty nice. It gives you a lot of information, and because you get to look at the hand, you usually, if they have more than 1 target for it, you can use it on the one they already have if they have one. And it's really, really good against Planeswalkers, especially Teferi, because Esper has no artifact removal other than Hostage Taker if they bring it in. And even then they have to play it right away, otherwise you can kill the Hostage Taker and get it back. That's the other thing that Disdainful Stroke does against Esper. It counters a Hostage Taker. But yeah, it is pretty reliable, and I think especially the Nexus deck has no answer for it usually. So naming Azcanta locks out one of them super powerful combo pieces, so you don't need to worry about that anymore, and you can just focus on stopping Reclamation, and then without Reclamation and Azcanta, it's gonna be rough for them to beat you, also because you apply a fair share of pressure. So yeah, this is for Planeswalkers, Azcanta, and Treasure Map mostly, because there's very little artifact removal in most decks, and some decks like Sultai, their artifact removal is their Planeswalker, which is locked down by Spyglass Vivian. And then we have 3 Warboss. I've tried a bunch of things in this slot. I had like Sarkhans for a while, some Azcantas and stuff. They were all kind of okay, but not great. They didn't do a whole lot. They mostly came in against control. Like, I actually brought them in against Nexus as well, because getting out an early or protected Niv-Mizzet is still really strong against them, but it's more like a desperation thing and not that great. And then I saw BBD as Warbosses at the PT, and I really liked the idea, and I tried it and immediately beat like, I think 2 Esper players with it. So it was even surprisingly good against Esper. Pretty happy with it. I could see even trying 4. That's one of the cards that makes 3 dive down a bit better, I guess. But yeah, all in all, a nice way to have more threats and apply early pressure against your bad matchups. Then we have 1 Beacon Bolt. It's nice to have at least 1 in the 75 usually, but is a really good 2-for-1. Gives you a lot of threat answer insurance, and you can bring it in against something like Esper that have a couple of creatures post-board, like Lyra, Hostage Taker, or Thief of Sanity, and even if they don't have one right now, you can discard it to Charter Course or mill it with Discovery for free, and then have it sit there as a backup in case they find something. It's also good against mid-range decks like Sultai. It just grinds through their threats. And then we have 2 Niv-Mizzet. I had 3 for a while, but I wasn't too impressed with it. The deck just doesn't hit land drops that well, especially past 6, and it takes a long time because you don't have that many cantrips anymore. You also don't have that much land, and I feel like for the 3 Niv-Mizzet you probably want the additional ramp cards like Sarkhan, Treasure Map, Azcanta that give you extra lands virtually and help you hit land drops. So 2 seems fine. It's a strong card, but it's also an expensive card. And yeah, and there's only so much room in the sideboard, and I'd rather have enough counters, because Nexus is a tough matchup, and having counters is one of the best things against them. And then I have 2 more Melody. Also started from like Menguchi's number of like 2, but the card is so good that I went up to 3 and then eventually moved the 3rd to the main deck. So I believe you want at least 3 in the 75. Force is probably a bit ambitious and a bit overkill, but 3 is really good. I wouldn't run less than 3. This comes in, at least 2 of those come, you want at least 2 of those against Sultai. Not sure about the 3rd, but maybe. And you want them against Mono Blue. Also something that I don't get. Why Menguchi in his boarding guide doesn't bring them in against Mono Blue. I think they are really good against Mono Blue, and if you just overload on removal and just kill all their stuff on side, they can never beat you. Like, I went, I think, like 10-1 against Mono Blue over the 70 matches. It's just ridiculous. You just crush them to dirt. And yeah, they're obviously amazing against Mono White. And against Mono Red, I wouldn't want them. I don't think they do enough. They're too slow, too clunky, too situational. They don't have a lot of creatures, not a lot of good creatures, not a lot of cheap creatures. Anything else where they are good? Yeah, that's about it. And regarding Niv-Mizzet, yeah, Niv-Mizzet is basically also just for the same matchups as like Warboss and stuff. Menguchi, for whatever reason, brings them in against Mono Blue, but I don't want them against Mono Blue. They're slow, they're clunky, they sit in my hand, they don't help me, and I never had issues winning the game. So I don't think Niv-Mizzet matters at all. Like, Melody is a million times better just don't board Niv-Mizzet against mono blue. It's unnecessary. The deck is not grindy and controlling in that matchup. The Phoenix deck that LSV is running is, and there Niv-Mizzet makes more sense against mono blue. Also because it has less shreds and takes out Phoenixes and stuff. But this deck, you just have 12 shreds. That's more than enough. And the Melodies, killing them with their shreds is another option. Okay, yeah, that's the list. As usual, gonna hop into some games in the top 20 of Mythic, show it in action, show you how it does and how to pilot it. And yeah, so see you in a moment with the first match. Stay tuned.